Right now, while you are listening, something is already shaping your next outcome, and it is not your circumstances, it is not your past, and it is not even what people have said about you. It is the words you agree with on the inside. Because before anything changes on the outside, something always changes on the inside first. And the question is not whether you are hearing information right now. The question is whether what you are hearing is quietly rebuilding your faith or silently reinforcing your doubt. Stay with this, because what you are about to understand has the power to completely shift how you pray, how you think, and how you respond to every challenge from this moment forward. Prayer is one of the most powerful privileges a believer possesses, yet many people approach it from a position of fear, panic, or desperation rather than faith. When difficulties arise, the natural human tendency is to react emotionally. Problems appear, pressure increases, uncertainty grows, and many people immediately begin praying from a place of anxiety. Their words become filled with worry rather than confidence. Instead of approaching God with assurance, they approach Him overwhelmed by fear. While God hears the cries of His people, there is a significant difference between praying from fear and praying from faith. Fear-based prayer focuses almost entirely on the problem. The conversation becomes centered on what is wrong, what might happen, and how impossible the situation appears. A person may spend most of their prayer time describing their difficulties, repeating their worries, and rehearsing their fears. Although this may provide temporary emotional relief, it often leaves the heart feeling just as anxious afterward because the focus never shifts away from the problem itself. Faith-based prayer operates differently. Faith acknowledges the reality of a challenge, but it refuses to allow the challenge to become greater than God's ability to intervene. Faith does not deny that problems exist. It simply places greater confidence in God's power than in the circumstances. A person praying in faith may still mention the difficulty they face, but their attention quickly turns toward trust, confidence, and expectation. This distinction is important because whatever dominates your focus will often influence your emotional condition. If your attention remains fixed entirely on the problem, fear tends to increase. The larger the problem appears in your mind, the smaller your confidence becomes. But when your attention shifts toward God's promises, His faithfulness, and His ability to help, your perspective begins changing. The problem may still exist, but it no longer occupies the highest position in your thinking. Many people unknowingly pray from desperation because they believe strong emotion automatically equals strong faith. They assume that the more emotional their prayer becomes, the more effective it is. However, faith is not measured by emotional intensity. A person can be highly emotional and still be filled with doubt. Likewise, a person can pray calmly and confidently while possessing tremendous faith. Faith is rooted in trust. Trust says, I may not have all the answers right now, but I believe God is faithful. Trust says, I do not understand every detail of this situation, but I know I am not alone. Trust says, the challenge is real, but it is not greater than God. This kind of trust changes the atmosphere of prayer. Instead of approaching prayer as a last resort, a person begins approaching prayer as a place of confidence and relationship. Another reason fear-based prayer is ineffective is because fear constantly seeks certainty from circumstances. Fear wants immediate evidence. It wants instant answers. It wants visible proof before it feels secure. When those things do not appear quickly, fear becomes discouraged and begins questioning whether prayer is working at all. Faith operates differently. Faith does not depend entirely on immediate evidence. Faith is able to remain steady even when answers seem delayed. It continues trusting even when circumstances have not yet changed. This perseverance is one of the greatest signs of genuine faith. Consider how often people pray repeatedly from panic because they are trying to convince themselves that something might happen. Their prayers become driven by anxiety rather than confidence. But faith-filled prayer is not an attempt to persuade God to care. It is an expression of trust in the God who already cares. Faith also affects the words a person speaks after prayer. Someone praying from fear often leaves prayer and immediately begins speaking negatively again. They talk about how hopeless the situation appears, how impossible the circumstances seem, and how worried they feel. In doing so, they reinforce the very fear they brought into prayer. A person praying from faith responds differently. After praying, they continue speaking with confidence. They continue expecting God's help. They continue trusting even when they cannot yet see visible results. This consistency strengthens faith and protects the heart from discouragement. Another important truth is that faith-filled prayer produces peace. Fear creates tension because it constantly focuses on uncertainty. But faith creates peace because it places confidence in God rather than circumstances. Even before the situation changes externally, something begins changing internally. The heart becomes calmer. The mind becomes steadier. Anxiety loses some of its power. This peace is not based on having every answer. It is based on trust. Many people mistakenly believe faith means never experiencing fear. In reality, faith often means choosing trust even when fear attempts to appear. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision not to allow fear to control you. Faith-filled prayer reflects that courage. It acknowledges the challenge but chooses trust. Anyway, over time, praying from faith transforms the entire spiritual life. Prayer becomes less about panic and more about partnership with God. It becomes less about rehearsing problems and more about reinforcing trust. Instead of leaving prayer discouraged, a person begins leaving prayer strengthened. Ultimately, prayer works when it is based on faith because faith directs attention toward God's character rather than toward the size of the problem. Fear magnifies obstacles. Faith magnifies God. Fear focuses on uncertainty. Faith focuses on trust. Fear expects defeat. Faith expects help. And when prayer is rooted in faith rather than fear, it becomes a place where confidence grows, peace increases, and the heart learns to trust God even before the answer becomes visible. Have you ever noticed how easy it is to let your emotions lead your prayers? Something goes wrong, and immediately fear begins speaking. A door closes and discouragement starts growing. A problem appears and anxiety begins filling your thoughts. Before long, many people find themselves praying entirely from what they feel in the moment rather than from what God has promised. Their emotions become the foundation of their prayer life, and without realizing it, they begin measuring God's faithfulness by their current circumstances. But there is a powerful truth every believer must understand. Effective prayer is not built on emotions. It is built on God's promises. Emotions are real, but emotions are constantly changing. One day you feel strong, and the next day you feel weak. One day you feel hopeful, and the next day you feel discouraged. One day you feel confident, and the next day you feel uncertain. If your prayer life depends entirely on your emotions, your faith will rise and fall every time your feelings change. That is why God's promises are so important. His promises remain constant when emotions fluctuate. His truth remains stable when circumstances become uncertain. His word remains dependable when everything around you seems unstable. Think about it this way. Imagine trying to build a house on shifting sand. No matter how beautiful the house may appear, the foundation is unstable. Eventually, pressure will expose that weakness. In the same way, a prayer life built only on emotions becomes unstable because emotions are constantly moving. But a prayer life built on God's promises stands firm because the foundation never changes. Many people pray something like this: God, I don't feel like you're helping me. I don't feel like anything is changing. I don't feel strong. I don't feel close to you. Now, those feelings may be genuine, but notice something important. The entire prayer is centered around feelings. Faith asks a different question. Faith says, what has God said? Because what God has said is often more important than what you currently feel. You may feel alone, but God's promise says He is with you. You may feel weak, but God's promise says strength is available. You may feel afraid, but God's promise speaks peace. You may feel overwhelmed, but God's promise reminds you that you do not have to carry every burden by yourself. This is where many believers experience a breakthrough in their prayer life. They stop allowing emotions to become the final authority. Instead, they begin placing greater confidence in what God has spoken. Now understand this clearly. Faith does not deny emotions. Faith does not pretend emotions do not exist. Faith simply refuses to let emotions sit on the throne. There will be days when you do not feel victorious. There will be days when you do not feel strong. There will be days when you do not feel full of faith. But faith is not measured by feelings. Faith is measured by whether you choose to trust God's promises despite your feelings. That is what makes faith powerful. Anyone can speak confidently when circumstances are perfect. Anyone can feel hopeful when everything is going well. But faith continues trusting when emotions are trying to pull you in the opposite direction. Think about how often fear uses feelings to control people. Fear says, you feel anxious, so something terrible must be about to happen. Fear says, you feel weak, so you probably cannot overcome this. Fear says, you feel discouraged, so nothing is changing. But feelings are not always accurate indicators of reality. Sometimes you can feel defeated and still be moving toward victory. Sometimes you can feel weak and still possess the strength you need. Sometimes you can feel uncertain while God is still directing your steps. This is why praying according to God's promises changes everything. It shifts your focus away from temporary emotions and places it on eternal truth. When you pray God's promises, your heart begins aligning with truth instead of fear. Your mind begins renewing itself. Your confidence grows stronger because your faith is no longer resting on unstable emotions. It is resting on something far greater. And here's another powerful truth. What you repeatedly pray and confess begins shaping your expectations. If you constantly pray from fear, fear becomes stronger. If you constantly pray from doubt, doubt becomes stronger. But if you consistently pray according to God's promises, faith becomes stronger. Your heart starts expecting God's help. Your mind starts anticipating His guidance. Your spirit becomes anchored in confidence rather than anxiety. And over time, something remarkable happens. You stop approaching prayer as a place to unload panic. Instead, prayer becomes a place where faith is strengthened. It becomes a place where promises are remembered. It becomes a place where peace is restored. So the next time emotions try to dominate your prayer life, remember this. Feelings may speak loudly, but God's promises speak with greater authority. Feelings change, circumstances change, situations change, but God's promises remain the same. Build your prayers on what He has said, not merely on what you feel. Let His promises become the foundation beneath every request, every declaration, and every expectation. Because when prayer is rooted in God's promises instead of unstable emotions, faith becomes stronger, peace becomes deeper, and confidence remains steady even when circumstances have not yet changed. Let me ask you a question that could completely change the way you pray. What if the greatest obstacle standing between you and your breakthrough is not the size of your problem, but you need to see something before you choose to believe? Most people are comfortable believing after they see results. If the situation improves, they believe. If the answer appears, they rejoice. If the breakthrough arrives, they become confident. But faith operates by a different set of rules. Faith has the courage to believe before the evidence appears. Faith chooses trust before circumstances change. Faith stands firm even when visible proof has not yet arrived. This is one of the most important spiritual laws you will ever understand. The natural mind says, I'll believe it when I see it. Faith says, I believe it, therefore I will eventually see it. That single difference separates fear from faith, doubt from confidence, and anxiety from peace. Think about how often people allow circumstances to dictate their level of belief. When everything is going well, their faith seems strong. When challenges appear, their confidence begins disappearing. Why? Because their belief was connected to what they could see rather than what they knew to be true. But genuine faith does not depend entirely on visible evidence. Imagine a farmer planting seeds in a field. The day after planting, he walks outside and sees nothing. The soil looks exactly the same as it did before. There is no visible harvest. There are no signs of growth above the surface. Now imagine if that farmer said, since I can't see anything, I guess nothing is happening. That would be foolish. Why? Because growth is already taking place beneath the surface. The unseen process started long before the visible evidence appeared. Faith works the same way. Many people abandon their confidence too quickly because they do not see immediate results. They pray once, wait a short time, and then begin questioning everything. Doubt enters their minds because they expected visible proof immediately. But faith understands something important. Unseen progress is. Still progress. Just because you cannot see movement does not mean nothing is happening. Just because the answer has not appeared does not mean God is absent. Just because circumstances look unchanged does not mean change is impossible. Faith has the ability to trust beyond what the eyes can currently observe, and this is where many people struggle. They want certainty before belief. They want proof before trust. They want visible results before confidence. But if visible proof always came, first faith would not be necessary. Faith becomes powerful precisely because it operates before evidence appears. Now notice something remarkable. Fear also believes before it sees. Think about it. When people worry constantly, what are they doing? They are believing something negative before it happens. They imagine future disasters. They expect worst-case scenarios. They assume failure before it arrives. In other words, fear is faith in the wrong direction. Fear believes bad things are coming. Faith believes God is working even when good things have not yet appeared. Both involve belief before evidence. The difference is where that belief is placed. This is why the battle for faith is often a battle of focus. What are you looking at? What are you listening to? What are you expecting? If your focus remains entirely on circumstances, your confidence will rise and fall with every situation. Good news will make you feel strong. Bad news will make you feel weak. Your emotions will constantly fluctuate because your faith is attached to visible conditions. But when your confidence is rooted in God's promises, something changes. You stop measuring God's faithfulness by today's circumstances. You stop allowing temporary situations to become permanent conclusions. You begin trusting that what God has spoken remains true even when visible evidence has not yet arrived. And that trust creates peace. People often think peace comes after the answer appears, but true peace comes. Faith settles the issue before the answer appears. The situation may still be unresolved. The challenge may still exist. The waiting season may continue. Yet deep inside, confidence remains because faith has already chosen to believe. This kind of faith changes the way you pray. Instead of praying with panic, you pray with expectation. Instead of praying with fear, you pray with confidence. Instead of begging repeatedly as though God has not heard you, you begin thanking Him because you trust that He is already at work. That is what believing before seeing looks like. It is not pretending problems do not exist. It is not denying reality. It is simply refusing to let reality have the final word. And here's what makes this principle so powerful. Every great breakthrough begins in the unseen before it appears in the seen. Every harvest begins as a hidden seed. Every building begins as an invisible blueprint. Every victory begins as an internal decision. And every answered prayer begins with faith choosing to believe before evidence arrives. So if you are in a season where you cannot yet see the answer, do not assume nothing is happening. Do not allow delay to weaken your confidence. Do not let temporary silence convince you that God is absent. Keep believing. Keep trusting. Keep standing on His promises, because faith sees what fear cannot see. Faith expects what circumstances cannot yet prove. And often the greatest miracles begin the moment a person decides to believe before they see. Let's talk about something that quietly steals the power from many people's prayers without them even realizing it. It's not always a major sin. It's not always a lack of desire. It's not even a lack of prayer. Often it's something much more subtle. It's doubt and unbelief. Doubt rarely announces its arrival. It doesn't usually come crashing through the front door. It slips in quietly through repeated negative thoughts, unanswered questions, delayed results, and discouraging circumstances. At first it sounds harmless. It whispers things like, what if this never changes? What if God doesn't answer? What if I'm believing for something impossible? And if those thoughts are entertained long enough, they begin to influence the heart. This is why understanding doubt is so important. Doubt does not always mean a person has no faith. In fact, many people have faith but allow doubt to grow alongside it. They believe one moment and question the next. They trust today and worry tomorrow. Their confidence rises and falls depending on circumstances. As a result, they live on an emotional roller coaster, never fully settling into the confidence that faith provides. Think about what doubt actually does. Doubt divides attention. Faith looks toward God's promise. Doubt looks toward the problem. Faith says, God can. Doubt says, but what if He doesn't? Faith says, there is hope. Doubt says, maybe, but probably not. You can immediately see how exhausting this becomes. The heart is being pulled in two different directions at the same time. Now, here's something important for every listener to understand. Doubt becomes stronger when it is repeated. The more you repeat fearful thoughts, the more believable they become. The more you speak negative words, the more natural they feel. The more you focus on obstacles, the larger those obstacles appear. Many people unknowingly feed doubt every day through their words. They pray for healing, then spend the rest of the day talking about how bad things are. They pray for breakthrough, then continually discuss why it probably won't happen. They pray for peace, then spend hours rehearsing fearful possibilities. Without realizing it, they are watering doubt while asking God to strengthen faith. This is where consistent confession becomes so important. Confession simply means agreeing with truth and speaking it consistently. It means refusing to let fear have the final word. It means choosing to speak what God has said instead of repeating what fear is saying. Now let's be clear. This is not about pretending problems do not exist. Faith does not ignore reality. Faith simply refuses to make reality the highest authority. A person can acknowledge a challenge and still speak confidently. They can recognize difficulty and still maintain hope. They can face uncertainty and still choose trust. That is what faith-filled confession does. When fear says you'll never make it, faith responds, I have strength for this season. When doubt says nothing is changing, faith responds, progress is happening even if I cannot see it yet. When anxiety says you should give up, faith responds, I will remain steady and continue believing. Notice something powerful here. Every faith-filled confession is pushing back against doubt. Every declaration of truth is strengthening confidence. Every agreement with God's promises is building a stronger foundation inside the heart. First, this may feel difficult. Why? Because doubt has often been practiced for years. Many people have spent a lifetime speaking fear, expecting disappointment, and preparing for failure. Negative thinking becomes automatic through repetition. But the good news is that faith grows through repetition too. The same way doubt was strengthened through repeated thoughts and words, faith becomes stronger through repeated truth. Every day you choose to speak faith, you weaken fear. Every day you choose to agree with God's promises, you strengthen confidence. Every day you refuse to surrender to negative thinking, you are renewing your mind. Over time, something remarkable begins happening. The thoughts that once controlled you lose their power. The fears that once dominated your attention become weaker. The doubts that once seemed overwhelming begin shrinking, not because circumstances changed overnight, but because your inner foundation became stronger, and that foundation changes everything. When challenges arise, you no longer collapse emotionally. When delays occur, you no longer assume failure. When obstacles appear, you no longer surrender immediately. Why? Because faith has been strengthened through consistent confession. You have trained your heart to agree with truth rather than fear. You have taught your mind to focus on possibility rather than limitation. You have built confidence one declaration at a time. And here is perhaps the most important lesson of all. Faith is not strengthened in a single dramatic moment. Faith is strengthened daily. It grows through consistent choices. It grows every time you reject fear. It grows every time you choose truth. It grows every time you refuse to let doubt have the final word. So if you want stronger faith, do not wait for a perfect circumstance. Start with your words. Start with your thoughts. Start by agreeing with God's promises even when your emotions try to argue, because doubt weakens confidence when it is repeated, but faith becomes powerful when truth is repeated consistently. And the voice you choose to repeat every day will eventually become the voice that shapes your future. Let's slow this down and really understand something that most people never fully grasp about prayer. Your words don't just express what you believe, they reinforce what you believe. Every time you speak, you are either strengthening faith or strengthening doubt. There is no neutral ground in the spiritual sense of confession. What you repeatedly say is what you are repeatedly training your heart to accept as reality. Now think about how many times a day people speak without even noticing the direction of their words. In moments of pressure, they say things like, "I can't handle this." In moments of delay, they say, "Nothing is working." In moments of fear, they say, "This is never going to change." And after saying it once, they often repeat it again, either out loud or in their thoughts. What's happening in those moments is not just emotional expression, it is spiritual conditioning, because the heart listens to what the mouth keeps repeating. If your words are constantly filled with fear, your heart begins to lean toward fear. If your words are constantly filled with doubt, your inner world begins to expect doubt. But if your words are consistently aligned with truth, your heart begins to shift toward confidence, even if circumstances have not yet changed. This is why confession is not just something you do once in prayer. It becomes a daily pattern of agreement. It is choosing over and over again to align your speech with what God has said rather than what fear is suggesting. And here is where many people miss it. They pray one thing but speak another. They pray for peace but speak anxiety all day. They pray for breakthrough but speak defeat all day. They pray for healing but speak sickness and fear all day. So what is happening? Their prayer is pointing in one direction, but their confession is pulling their heart in the opposite direction. And that creates internal conflict. Faith is trying to build confidence, while fear is constantly tearing it down through repeated words. Now listen carefully. Consistency is what determines which voice becomes dominant. One prayer of faith is powerful, but it must be supported by consistent agreement. One declaration of truth can shift your mindset, but repeated declarations are what stabilize it, because the mind does not change through occasional statements. It changes through repetition. Think of it like training. If you go to the gym once, you don't become strong. But if you consistently train the same muscles over time, strength develops. In the same way, if you speak fear once, it doesn't define you. But if fear is your consistent language, it becomes your mental strength. And the same is true for faith. Repeated confession builds spiritual strength. So what happens when someone begins to consistently speak in agreement with God's promises? At first, it may feel unnatural. You may not feel what you are saying. Your circumstances may not reflect what you are declaring, but something deeper is happening beneath the surface. You are training your heart to move in a new direction. Every time you say, "God is with me," you weaken loneliness. Every time you say, "I will not be defeated," you weaken fear. Every time you say, "I am receiving strength," you weaken discouragement. And over time, those repeated confessions begin to reshape your internal expectation, because expectation is built by repetition. Now here's another important truth. Your words don't just affect you emotionally, they affect your spiritual posture. A person who constantly speaks defeat begins to expect defeat even before anything happens. But a person who constantly speaks truth begins to expect victory even in uncertain situations. That expectation changes how they respond to challenges. Instead of panicking, they pause. Instead of quitting, they stand. Instead of collapsing under pressure, they remain steady. Not because the pressure disappeared, but because their internal foundation changed through consistent confession. And this is where real transformation begins, not when circumstances immediately change, but when your inner agreement changes. So the question is not just, what are you praying for? The deeper question is, what are you repeatedly agreeing with after you pray? Because your prayer opens the door, but your confession often determines whether your heart walks through it or turns back in fear. If you want stronger faith, don't only focus on praying stronger prayers, focus on speaking stronger agreement. Let your words stop rehearsing fear and start reinforcing truth. Let your mouth stop echoing doubt and start building confidence. Because in the end, what you consistently say will either weaken your faith or strengthen it, but it will never leave it unchanged. Let's go deeper. into something that quietly shapes the outcome of almost every prayer life. The constant battle between fear and faith inside your mind. Most people think this battle is loud, dramatic, and obvious, but in reality it is subtle. It happens in thoughts you barely notice, in reactions you don't question, and in repeated assumptions you accept without realizing their impact. Fear and faith both operate through repetition, but they are moving in opposite directions. Fear is built when negative thoughts are repeated. Faith is built when truth is repeated. And whichever one you feed consistently will eventually become the dominant voice in your inner world. Now think about how fear actually grows. It rarely begins as full-blown panic. It begins as a small thought. What if this doesn't work out? Then that thought gets repeated. It gets rehearsed in different ways. It gets imagined in detail. It gets spoken in conversation. And slowly that small thought becomes a strong expectation. That is how fear matures, through repetition. And once fear becomes strong enough, it starts shaping perception. It makes problems look bigger than they are. It makes delays feel like denial. It makes silence feel like rejection. Fear is not just an emotion, it is a filter. It changes how you interpret everything around you. But faith works the same way in the opposite direction. Faith is not just a sudden feeling of confidence. Faith is built through repeated exposure to truth. Every time you speak God's promises, every time you meditate on what He has said, every time you choose to agree with truth instead of fear, you are reinforcing faith inside your heart. At first, it may not feel powerful. You may say words of faith while still feeling uncertainty. You may declare truth while emotions are still unsettled. But repetition is doing something deeper than emotion. It is training your internal system to respond differently over time. This is why consistency matters so much in prayer and confession. A single moment of faith is powerful, but a lifestyle of repeated faith is transformative. Because what you repeat becomes what you rely on, and what you rely on becomes what you expect. Now consider this carefully. Every person is already practicing repetition every day. The question is not whether repetition is happening. The question is what is being repeated. Some people repeatedly rehearse fear without realizing it. They replay negative conversations. They imagine worst-case scenarios. They speak doubt about their future. And even when they pray, they return to fear immediately afterward through their words and thoughts. Others, however, begin intentionally repeating truth. They speak hope even when they feel uncertain. They declare strength even when they feel weak. They remind themselves of God's promises even when circumstances are unclear. And over time, that repetition builds something stronger inside them. One of the most powerful effects of repetition is mental conditioning. Your mind begins to accept as normal whatever it hears most often. If it hears fear repeatedly, fear becomes normal. If it hears faith repeatedly, faith becomes normal. That is why people often don't realize how conditioned they have become until they try to change. Changing direction feels uncomfortable at first because you are breaking old repetition patterns. But persistence creates new mental pathways. And eventually, what once felt unnatural becomes your new normal. Another important truth is that repetition shapes emotional responses. A mind trained by fear reacts quickly, emotionally, and often impulsively. A mind trained by faith responds with greater stability. It may still feel pressure, but it does not immediately collapse under it. This is why two people can face the same situation but respond completely differently. One is responding from repeated fear. The other is responding from repeated faith. The situation is not the only factor, the internal training is. Now here is where prayer connects deeply with this principle. Prayer is not meant to be a one-time emotional release followed by a return to fear-based thinking. Prayer is meant to be part of a repeated system that reinforces truth. When you pray, you are aligning yourself with God's perspective. But when you consistently speak fear afterward, you are undoing that alignment. That is why consistency in faith-filled confession is so important. It keeps your inner world aligned with what you believe during prayer. Over time, repetition creates expectation. And expectation becomes powerful because it determines how you approach life. A fearful expectation anticipates loss. A faith-filled expectation anticipates help, guidance, and breakthrough even when timing is uncertain. And here is the key point. Fear and faith are both trained through what you repeat daily, not what you feel occasionally. Feelings fluctuate. Circumstances change, but repetition shapes identity. So if fear has been repeated for years, it will take intentional, consistent repetition of truth to reshape it. Not one moment, not one prayer, but steady alignment over time. And eventually something powerful happens. What once required effort becomes natural. Faith becomes your default response. Peace becomes more stable. Confidence becomes more consistent. Not because life became easier, but because your internal repetition changed. And when repetition changes, expectation changes. And when expectation changes, everything begins to look different even before anything outside of you changes at all. Let's bring everything into one powerful truth that can reshape the way you see your future. Expectation is not just something you feel, it is something you build. And what you build internally will eventually shape what you experience externally. Every person listening right now is living inside some level of expectation. Even if they are not aware of it, there is an internal picture of how they think life will unfold. Some people expect struggle before they even wake up. Others expect delay, disappointment, or constant pressure. And without realizing it, those expectations quietly shape how they interpret every moment of their day. But here is what most people never stop to consider. Expectation is trained. It is not random. It is not accidental. It is formed through repeated thoughts, repeated words, and repeated focus over time. If someone constantly focuses on problems, they begin expecting more problems. If someone constantly speaks defeat, they begin expecting defeat. If someone constantly imagines worst-case scenarios, they begin living with a mindset prepared for loss instead of victory. Expectation becomes a lens, and that lens determines how everything is seen. Now think about how powerful this is in prayer. Many people pray for change, but they continue living with expectation of no change. They pray for breakthrough, but internally expect delay. They pray for healing, but deep inside still anticipate ongoing struggle. And without realizing it, their internal expectation is working against their external prayer. Because expectation always influences interpretation. Two people can face the same situation, but experience it completely differently because of what they expect. One person sees delay and thinks nothing is happening. Another person sees delay and thinks something is still developing. One person sees a closed door and assumes rejection. Another person sees a closed door and believes direction is being refined. The difference is not always the situation. The difference is expectation. Now here is something very important. Expectation is shaped by repetition. What you repeatedly think about becomes what you begin to expect. What you repeatedly speak becomes what you begin to anticipate. What you repeatedly focus on becomes what you begin to assume will happen. This is why your internal life matters so much, because your thoughts are not just passing ideas, they are building expectation. And your words are not just emotional reactions, they are reinforcing expectation. Over time, this creates a cycle. What you expect influences how you interpret life. How you interpret life influences your emotions. Your emotions influence your decisions, and your decisions influence your direction. So expectation quietly becomes a driving force behind your entire experience of life. Now consider what happens when expectation is shaped by faith instead of fear. When a person begins to expect good, even in uncertain seasons, their entire inner response changes. They don't collapse at the first sign of difficulty. They don't immediately assume failure when things are unclear. Instead, they carry an internal awareness that something greater may still be unfolding. This is not denial. This is trust. Trust that God is still working even when evidence is not yet visible. Trust that delay is not the same as denial. Trust that unseen progress may still be happening. And that trust slowly reshapes expectation. At first, it may feel like a battle to maintain that kind of mindset. Old patterns of fear may try to return. Negative thoughts may still appear. But expectation is strengthened through repetition. Every time you choose to focus on truth instead of fear, you are reshaping expectation. Every time you choose to speak faith instead of doubt, you are reinforcing a new internal direction. And over time, something begins to shift. You stop automatically expecting the worst. You stop assuming failure before effort. You stop interpreting every delay as defeat. Instead, you begin expecting guidance, strength, and possibility even when circumstances are still unclear. And that expectation changes how you live. It changes how you pray. It changes how you respond. It changes how you endure waiting seasons. Because expectation determines emotional atmosphere. Fear-based expectation creates anxiety before anything even happens. Faith-based expectation creates peace even in uncertainty. Now here is a powerful truth. Expectation does not guarantee immediate visible results, but it does determine internal stability while you wait for results. And stability matters. Because many people lose heart not because nothing is happening, but because their expectation collapses during the waiting process. They stop believing before the process is complete. They stop trusting before the answer appears. And often they give up right before change begins to unfold. But when expectation is rooted in faith, something different happens. You remain steady. You remain consistent. You remain confident. Not because everything is already visible, but because your internal expectation is anchored in truth rather than circumstance. And over time, that steady expectation becomes strength. Strength to continue believing. Strength to continue speaking truth. Strength to continue standing even when answers are delayed. So understand this clearly. Your future experience is deeply connected to your current expectation. Not just what you say once. Not just what you feel occasionally, but what you consistently expect. Because expectation is built over time, and what you build inside will eventually shape what you experience outside. And when expectation is trained by faith, reinforced by truth, and strengthened by consistency, it becomes a powerful internal force that carries you forward even before everything around you begins to change. So as you move forward from this moment, don't let what you see become louder than what you believe. Don't let what you feel rewrite what you know to be true. And don't let delay convince you that denial is the answer. Hold your ground in faith. Speak with confidence. Think with clarity. And align your inner world with truth, even when your outer world is still catching up. Because the breakthrough is not only in what you are waiting for, it is also being shaped in who you are becoming while you wait. And when faith stays consistent, when words stay aligned, and when expectation stays anchored in truth, what once looked delayed will suddenly begin to reveal that it was never denied.